IOC 100, Chapter 5. This is the second half of the chapter. This focuses on how do you find a topic? What are you going to do your speech on? So the thing to think about is the elusive hypothesis. In the same way that on safari or out in the wilderness you might be searching for something. I think that it can be tricky and hard to kind of wrap your head around and identify and capture that. What is this hypothesis that you're supposed to be doing? So one of the ways to think about this is that you're going to muck around in an area in the same way you might just go and explore physically an environment. In terms of research, you're going to muck around in a topic area. It's going to bring you to questions. And then you already know stuff and you already understand stuff, and it's going to, there will be ways in which the questions that you encounter, you are also going to have some ideas about answers. And that's it. That's the hypothesis, is your best guess at what the answer to a question is. So oftentimes you're dealing with this, what's my thesis statement versus what is this hypothesis? So hypothesis is something that you have as you're embarking on your research project. It's a statement that you're like, I think this is true, but you don't know that it's true. If you know it's true, then it's not a hypothesis. Then it is a thesis statement. And it really, what I want you to be working on here is not stuff that you know, but stuff that you're guessing about. Once you actually have done the work and found the evidence and put the whole thing together and really understand it, that's when you have a thesis. That you've got this backing in the evidence. QED, quod erat demonstrandum. This is a shorthand that primarily mathematicians would use back in classical period to, at the end of a proof, thus I prove. So that's the goal you have. To start with, I've got a tricky question. I think I know what the answer is. I do the research, I find the information, I can prove this true. So for this class, how do I suggest you find a topic? So we're going to create a list of issues. We've already done that. That should be a good starting place, giving you some sparks of ideas. So you need to spend a little time with that, muck around in that thing, think about what are you interested in, what are you not interested in, add more, or find limitations within that. I have a couple things, suggestions for you. Like if you already know everything about this, then you probably should abandon it, not use it for this class. In general, beware of that feeling of, I already know this. The world is very complicated and difficult, and the more you can embrace the notion of you don't know much, the stronger you're going to be. This is something Socrates would say. Socrates would be like, I don't know anything. When people were like, you know so much, he'd be like, no, I don't know anything. All I have is questions. What I'll tell you is that the more you learn, the more you discover you don't know. That there's sort of a level of, when you learn things, you get to a new mountain and you stand on that mountain and you can see further. But the further you can see, the more you see that you don't know. There's stuff that you know, like you know perhaps how to drive a car. And there's stuff that you know you don't know, like you maybe don't know how to fly a plane. And you know for sure you don't know how to fly a plane. This is something you know that you don't know. But there's a whole bigger category of the things that you don't know, which in fact encompasses most human knowledge. All of us have barely scraped the surface, and there's vastly more to know than any of us can ever learn in a lifetime. So all you're going to really do is keep moving your horizons out. The more you know, in fact, it's exponential. You discover there's so much more you don't know. So I'll just caution you, if you're like, I already know everything about this, be really careful about that attitude and impulse. Chances are excellent you actually don't know as much as you think you know. Sometimes there's topics that you're like, you are confident you can't see the other side, for personal reasons, for social reasons, political reasons, I don't know. But sometimes it's like our ideas are fixed. And if your ideas on something are really fixed, then it's probably something you should avoid. Um, because I want you to be able to see the other side. I want you to authentically be able to put yourself empathically in the shoes of the people on the other side. And if you just feel like, I can't see them, they're monsters, they're awful, then it's probably a good idea to pick a different topic. Some topics are just going to give you too much stress, and it's not worth it. I could think of a topic like abortion that might give some people undue stress. So don't feel like you got to take on something like that. In fact, I would suggest you don't. Pick something that's just not going to stress you out too much. So you got to find a balance here, right? What's something you're interested in, but you don't know everything about? What is it that is kind of exciting but not too stressful? You got to find that happy medium. So once you've identified a topic, you need to move toward a hypothesis. How do you do that? Well, you're going to start with basic preliminary research, like reading Wikipedia pages. I think Wikipedia is brilliant. It's great. It's going to give you a lot of this really basic, superficial level knowledge, which you need in order to ask the right questions and dig in deeper. You got to start somewhere. So start with what's right there and easy. Do a Google search. Read some Wikipedia pages. It's a great place to start. Spend some time thinking about your topic. What do you know? Why do you think it's true? What conclusions have you already drawn? Do you really know it? What is the evidence for that? And really start to inquire of yourself of why you think you know what you know. What evidence do you really have? Thinking about the kind of speech you're doing in order to help focus these topics. You've got a general topic, and then I need to know exactly what is this speech going to do. Oftentimes, with informative speaking, it's better to focus on the problems. In persuasive speaking, you're going to want to focus on the solutions. But if you think about, for informative, you're going to be talking about the problem or problems. You're going to be talking about the history, the background. That kind of stuff is better suited for informative speaking. Scope and scale, you got only 5 minutes. So how much really can you cover? You want to pick something narrow, that you can go narrow and deep, not wide and shallow. And then you're going to come up, right? How do you come up with a hypothesis? I think this is true, and I can discuss it in this time. And then you're going to be able to take that and embark on your research. And in your research, you discover, were you right or wrong? Your hypothesis isn't necessarily your thesis. Because sometimes you got a hypothesis and you go and you do your research and you go, turns out my hypothesis was wrong. And then you have a thesis that's different from your hypothesis, but you still have a thesis. You have something to talk about because you've discovered something to be true. QED. So here's a quick example. For me, I'm interested in the wildlife. I'm interested in wilderness preservation. I love the wilderness. I go to the wilderness. I think wilderness preservation is an important societal thing that we as a country have done a good job, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, Republican President Teddy Roosevelt, who did some of the very first preservation of land in our country, creating national parks, national monuments, and things like that. If you haven't already done so, you should go visit the Teddy Roosevelt grasslands in western North Dakota. Stunningly beautiful. Okay, so I'm interested in wildlife and wilderness preservation. Maybe I think about wolf populations. In my lifetime, in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of question about how do we manage wolves in the U.S. So maybe my first informative speech is wolf populations are healthy and stable, right? This would be a hypothesis that I have right now, and I could go out and do the research. If indeed I found out that that's true, and I think it is true, that they're healthy and stable right now, I could do a speech where I'm laying out the facts to show that, in fact, right now, populations are healthy and stable. A second informative speech, maybe I do an overview of how have wolves been managed over the years, what kind of different policies have been in place. When I was young, they were on the endangered species list. And wolves were so endangered that they were listed with these others and given strong protections. In the last 10 years, wolves in Minnesota have been hunted and trapped, and then taken off of that list and put back on that list. In Yellowstone National Park, they have been managed in a variety of ways. So I can easily do a speech where I'm overviewing different kinds of wolf management procedures that we as a country have employed. And then finally, perhaps I could do a persuasive speech where I'm going to say the EPA should make 3 changes to how wolves are being managed, right? And I would specify what those changes are, because we got to keep ranchers happy, right? One of the big problems is that in the same places where wolves are is the same places where ranchers are trying to run cattle and make a living. How do we manage that? How do we keep ranchers happy and keep a thriving natural species out there as well? So not an easy problem. We've tried it in many different ways over the last 100, 150 years, from shooting every wolf anybody ever saw to making it criminal to shoot a wolf, right? Somewhere in there, we need to be able to figure out how to manage this population. So I could make a persuasive speech along these lines. So this is one of the ways I want you to think about, what is this process for you? You're going to have a topic area, and then within that topic area, you're going to find the very specific speeches. So at this point, you don't need to have all 3 of these things. You don't need to know what both of your informatives and your persuasive are going to be as you start. But really just that first one is where you need to be. You might have an idea of where you're going in the persuasive, but you don't have to lock that in. Just giving you an idea of how these speech topics might mesh together. So once you have come up with a hypothesis, then you need to test it. So, is it a valid hypothesis or not? So there are a couple that are really useful for this class. Different kinds of hypotheses, like math hypotheses, science hypotheses. Often we'll use other kinds of tests as well, but here's 3 basic hypothesis tests that tells you whether you're on track or not. First of all, is your hypothesis testable and falsifiable? Is it possible to prove that it's not true? So if your hypothesis is that space aliens are responsible, well, it turns out that that's not a valid hypothesis, because we can't test to see whether the space aliens are out there or not. We can't prove that there aren't space aliens. That's the falsifiable part. So if you can't prove that it's not true, it just means that it's not a valid hypothesis. We can't use the scientific method to gather the information and test it. So that's the first one. Is it testable and falsifiable? If not, it's not a valid hypothesis. It might be that space aliens are responsible, but we can't use the scientific method to evaluate that. Is it phrased simply? This is the notion of Occam's razor. And Occam was a medieval monk. All things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. So this is where a bunch of conspiracy theories fall apart, because you can't phrase them simply. It's just so ridiculously complicated that it's dismissible. So if your hypothesis can't be phrased simply, rework it. It's got to be able to be phrased simply, or it's just not worth investigating. Lastly, is your research method congruent with existing research systems? So this is a picture of Newton with his laws of motion. So if your research is going to include something that's outside the norms of science, it's dismissible there as well. You have to be able to research it using scientific tests, using peer-reviewed journals, those kinds of things. Journalism, ethics, those kinds of things. If you've got a system that it doesn't work within those existing systems, it's not a valid hypothesis. Okay, once you've got that going, you're kind of getting started here. Okay, how do you take and then guide your research? You've kind of got a topic, you've got an idea, and you've even generated a hypothesis. You've poked around on Wikipedia a little bit and the web a little bit, but you actually need to do more in-depth research than that. So how do you frame your topic and think about it in order to guide your research? As always, thinking about scope and scale, how much time do you have? Rule of 3, right? Anytime you can sort of go, I think it's going to be these 3 parts, right? If I was going to talk about motorcycles, for example, I might say, okay, let's, I'm going to talk about the engine, I'm going to talk about the suspension system, and the steering, right? Those are sort of three fundamental parts of a motorcycle. Could I talk about other things as well? Yeah, but somehow in our brains, it's easier if we just have these sort of three chunks. It's a really manageable way to handle sharing information and organizing information. So thinking about, is there a way you can take and break your topic into three chunks? Think always about, what does your audience want and need? What do they already know? And what do they need to know? So always returning to think about the audience needs. So as you are undertaking your research, you start off with this hypothesis and you're taking it into your research, but just know that you're going to continue to change and develop it. It's not static as you get into your research. So it's recursive. So if you look at this graphic here, plan, assess, locate, revise, and it goes around and around and around. And this is part of what's going to happen, is that you're going to embark on your research with your hypothesis, and maybe you find some information that asks you to think about it differently. And then maybe you adapt your hypothesis. And it's like, oh, I thought I was looking for this, but it really looks like I'm looking for that. This is the thing I think is true now. I've done some research. I'm changing what my hypothesis is as I'm heading toward my thesis. Oftentimes, it's useful to develop from the general to the specific. So as you got this broad idea and then getting down to more and more specific. If you start at butter crunch lettuce, it's more complicated if you need to go, oh, okay, I have to back off toward, root vegetables or greens or something else like that. It's generally better to start more general and head toward the specific. As you conduct your research, just be careful with the internet. People can publish all kinds of crap there, and it's just not verifiable in the same way that scholarship, peer-reviewed journals, even things like the government websites and things like that are much more valid than just people putting stuff out on the web, right? There are think tanks and groups and organizations that can have a web page and they can, spout all kinds of nonsense. You can't rely on it. So you're going to use the internet because it's the World Wide Web of information and there's a ton of stuff out there. But be careful as you're going on that. There's a lot of garbage out there. Use your library. It's amazing. We have this beautiful library. Also, in particular, use librarians. So reference librarians are a strange breed of people. They love research, and they love people who love research. So if you are working on your project, and it's always a good idea to just check in with a reference librarian. One of the things that I learned to do as a graduate student was to take my research project after I'd spent, I don't know, 4 hours, 10 hours. I'd spent some time on it. I'd done some work and started to dig up some things. And I would take the stuff I found to the reference librarian and just ask them to review it. What do you think? Are there any journals that they know about that I might go and search in particular? Are there search terms that I should be using that I'm not as I'm doing this? And invariably, the reference librarian would either just be able to give me an assurance of everything looks great here, or more often they would say, here's an idea, here's a resource, here's a reference, and give me a whole slew of more information. So reference librarians can be your best friends. I will say this, they don't want to do the work for you, they want to help you do the work. So if you come in with nothing, they're not going to be able to give you much. The more you bring to them, the more they're going to help you. Okay, a couple cautions. Don't just rely on personal experience. You may have done things, you may have seen things, you may have experience in some of these things. Just recognize that your own experiences at this stage are very limited. Your own level of expertise, as it's going to be perceived by the world, is going to be very, very small. Isaac Newton, right? Standing on the shoulders of giants. So when you can lean into the experiences of scholars and researchers and quote them then they're the giants, and you don't have to be enormous. You just stand on their shoulders. Watch out, as I've said, for these shallow internet sources. You've got to go deep than just some of these internet sources and, ideafinder.com. I mean, really? What is that? Who's responsible for it? Who's responsible to make sure that it's the truth? You just got to be really careful. Not a bad idea to go poke around there, but it's not reliable. It's too shallow. Record your information. This is how you avoid plagiarism. This is how you become a great scholar, is you reach out and you find all the great ideas out there. You gather them together and then list them. Makes you a